Energy Media readers, today we're going to be talking about environmental regulation and the Alberta government's decision to suspend some of the oil and gas regulation during the pandemic. And we'll specifically be talking to Professor Shaun Fluker from the University of Calgary, who's written a very interesting blog post about the government's decision. So welcome to the interview, Shaun.
Thanks for having me.
Why don't we start off, can you give us kind of an overview of your argument in your blog post?
Okay, well, basically, the Alberta government or the Minister of Environment issued an order this week suspending what we call routine reporting requirements that are contained in licenses or approvals issued under environmental legislation. These reporting measures are, things that report information and data collected by operators in the context of whatever project they happen to be operating. And it's an important component of the regulatory scheme. So I guess the order caught my attention because we're essentially suspending, that component for the foreseeable future.
Now, is this unusual? Are we seeing other jurisdictions maybe doing the same thing because of the pandemic?
Well, at least from what I've been following, it is a little bit unusual. The U.S., the Environmental Protection Agency, issued a similar order late last week as well. One of the distinctions which I noted in my piece is that the EPA, at least attempts to make a connection between, emergency measures that we all have to deal with under COVID-19 and the relief granted to operators. The Alberta order, doesn't make the same attempt.
Now, the industry has been arguing for a long time that it needs less regulation or streamlined regulation or less red tape, however you want to describe it. I've read some of the economic studies of the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers, and that's a consistent theme. They want less regulatory burden and cost. Is there a danger here that the Alberta government lowers the bar or removes it entirely during the pandemic, and then when it comes back, we don't go back to the same regime, we go to some more modified, less effective regime?
Well, I think that danger, that's very low. All the minister has done here is suspend existing obligations. And so, those obligations are still written into these approvals and licenses, and the existing legislation that really makes those terms and conditions legally binding hasn't been amended. So no, I would say we're not looking at that particular scenario at the moment.
Is there any potential then for some sort of, I don't want to say catastrophic, but a spill, some other event that normally would be governed by these regulations, but now would not be governed by them?
Again, no, I don't think so. I mean, these are routine reporting obligations. And so environmental legislation in Alberta and the Alberta Energy Regulator have existing requirements that require operators to report what we would call hazardous or dangerous releases. None of those requirements have been suspended. So we're looking at reporting in the normal course as opposed to those more extreme events.
Sure. Is there any danger or disadvantage or anything by the government doing this?
Well, what this does do is create a gap, an information gap, and a lot of those approvals and licenses, what we talk about these reporting requirements as being in the normal course, they're an essential component of the regulatory apparatus because, we rely heavily, as many jurisdictions do, on a self-reporting mechanism for monitoring and compliance. And so without those reports, the regulatory machinery is not going to be notified when there's a problem, albeit a smaller problem than an extreme event. Nonetheless, the regulatory system is in place to ensure that operations are conducted pursuant to particular thresholds and standards, we're not going to know when those standards or thresholds aren't being met until this order is rescinded.
I can imagine that some of the landowners who are going to watch this interview may be, a little bit worried about what might happen over the course of the next 3, 6, or 9 months.
Yeah, so I mean, there are some concerns there. Again, the regulatory system being as complicated as it is, we're not necessarily talking about all of the terms and conditions that attach to licenses, for example, that oil and gas industries operate, because a lot of those requirements are directly related to legislation that the Alberta Energy Regulator oversees. For example, the minister's order of this week doesn't reference that legislation, although some of those approvals and licenses may have an oil and gas context to them. I mean, that's one of the issues here, frankly, is, we don't necessarily know which approvals may or may not be affected by this. The minister's order references the Water Act, the Environmental Protection and Enhancement Act, and the Public Lands Act. I mean, those are sweeping pieces of legislation that cover a lot of territory, but not all the territory. So, as is often a problem with the exercise of emergency powers like this, it's too short on the detail.
Gotcha. So Mike, if I understand this correctly, it's not a really big issue if this lasts for a month or 2 months or 3 months, but how many months or years should the pandemic drag on and the stay suspended? When does it become an issue?
Well, I mean, that's a good question. And you're absolutely right. If we were talking about a really short-term measure here, we probably wouldn't be having this conversation. The fact of the matter is, it's clear that nobody really knows how long these measures are going to be in place. The order does mention August the 14th as sort of as a date. Obviously, I think the minister was probably picking that, perhaps optimistically. So that's one of the issues here, is we don't know. So to the extent this is creating a gap, or this is impacting the ability of the regulatory system to implement its monitoring and compliance function, we could be seeing that impaired for some length of time. Now, I've read others say, well, this is just a reporting requirement, and of course we still have inspectors that can go out and check for compliance, and absolutely, but there's only so many of those resources to go around, and frankly, in light of the restrictions that we are all facing, one has to wonder how much of that's going to take place as well.
So if I sum up, I guess this is an issue that is not serious in the short term, could be more serious in the medium to long term, and something that we should monitor so that we know exactly where we are, where the government is and the industry is.
Yeah, certainly if this was a very short-term measure, the fact that it doesn't really have an end date is a concern. I would say the other thing is that as a blanket suspension, it's, in my view anyways, not paying enough attention to detail in relation to the operators that are out there that absolutely need this relief, and the operators that are out there that frankly don't need this relief. I would have liked to have seen a little bit more detail in that regard, although I can appreciate, in the interests of acting quickly, the temptation to issue a blanket suspension was probably too great to resist.
Shaun, thank you very much for this. Really appreciate it, and we will follow up with you in the future to see how this story unfolds.
Sounds good. Thanks for having me.